Okay, well, let's get started here. Welcome, everybody. My name is Corey Lemke, and I'm one of the co-chairs of the Global Asian American Pacific Islander Caucus here at Democrats Abroad. My pronouns are he, they, and today's event is being held in conjunction with the Democrats Abroad LGBTQ plus caucus in celebration of Pride Month. So welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us wherever in the world you are. We have people from States, Germany, France, Korea, Japan, all over the place. So welcome. And I'm gonna go ahead and actually share my slides here. So as I said, my name is Corey Lemke, or Hawundo is my Korean name. And I use Hide. We're glad to have Amy Sueyoshi and Stan Yogi here with us today, and I'll introduce them a little bit more as we get started here. Just a disclaimer here, the views and opinions expressed in today's presentation do not necessarily reflect the official position of Democrats Abroad, the Democratic Party, or any of the other organizations that are mentioned in today's talk. And this presentation will be recorded until we get into the Q&A session, after which point we'll stop that and kind of have more of a discussion, a community discussion there. This event is also being streamed live on Facebook, just for everybody's information there. Just kind of an overview of today's schedule. I'll give a brief introduction to the host caucuses. I'll acknowledge J-Sei, the Nikkei community and cultural organization hosting the exhibition, and then welcome our featured guest. We'll proceed with a brief Q&A after the presentation, and hopefully close at the top of the hour or a little past. We'll see how much discussion we have. So, the recently formed AAPI caucus seeks to speak to and speak for the diverse AAPI communities among the Democrats Abroad membership in all three regions: Asia Pacific, Europe, Middle East, Africa, and the Americas. In order to address these issues and more, the AAPI caucus hopes to act as a unified voice to call for structural reforms and for recognizing the AAPI perspective within Democrats Abroad. For more information, please visit us at democratsabroad.org/AAPI. And please take a quick look at our goals as a caucus. Today's event advances several of our goals, but especially goal 5 here, championing AAPI history and culture to promote intercultural understanding. This event is also being co-hosted by the Democrats Abroad LGBT plus caucus, which is the constituency group for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and intersex members and allies. And again, for more information, visit us at democratsabroad.org/LGBTQ. The LGBTQ plus caucus has been up to a lot this year, and a big goal for this year has been cross-caucus collaboration, and we really think this event captures the spirit of that. And so we're very, very excited to co-host this between the AAPI and LGBTQ plus caucus. And one final thank you here, special thanks to J-Sei for hosting the exhibition, the Seen and Unseen exhibition. J-Sei is a community care and cultural organization that brings families and generations together to nurture and pass on Nikkei values and traditions, which are at the core of their services. For more information, please visit them at their website. And finally, it's my pleasure to introduce our featured presenters today. Amy Sueyoshi is Dean of the College of Ethnic Studies with a joint faculty appointment in Race and Resistance Studies and Sexuality Studies at San Francisco State University. She has received numerous awards for her scholarship in queer history and for her community engagement and advocacy. Stan Yogi is an award-winning author of several books, and his essays have appeared in newspapers and academic journals. He has co-curated traveling exhibits on civil liberties. He is co-chair of Okairi, a Nikkei LGBTIQ plus community based in Los Angeles. So without further ado, please welcome our featured guest, Dr. Sueyoshi and Mr. Stan Yogi. Welcome. And I'll turn this over to Stan here.
Thank you, Corey. Amy and I are grateful to you and to Susan Takao, for inviting us to speak today. And we also want to acknowledge Karen Frankenstein for providing technical support. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you for joining us today. Amy and I are going to take you on a brief tour of the Seen and Unseen exhibit. And then we're going to be in conversation with each other about the genesis for the exhibit, the process of putting it together, and our favorite objects in the exhibit. And then we'll open it up for your questions. But before doing that, I just wanted to acknowledge some folks that were involved with the exhibit. It's up for another week, and I'm going to provide the web link how to access it at the end of our presentation. But some of you may have already seen it, and if you have, you will have noticed how beautiful it is, and we can thank the exhibit designer, Nalini Elias, for the beautiful design. The exhibit also relies on the research of scholars, including Amy, but also Tina Takamoto, who is the Dean of Humanities and Sciences at the California College of the Arts. We've also relied on research from Andrew Leong, who's an assistant professor of English at UC Berkeley, and historian Greg Robinson, who's a professor at the University of Quebec at Montreal. So I'm going to share my screen now to begin our presentation. So just bear with me. So hopefully you're able to see that. And I'm going to pass the baton to Amy, who will take us on the first leg of the tour of the exhibit. And Amy, do you want to share any welcoming remarks as well?
Thanks, Dan, and thanks to all of you for attending today. Happy Pride Month for many of you. I wanted to we're just going to go through a brief preview of the exhibit, and we're hoping that you folks will go to the link and also check out the exhibit yourself. One of the things that we've found that was great about this online exhibit, we'd initially planned to do it in a brick and mortar space at J-Sei, and we were worried about how it would look online, but we found that in the online format, people can kind of dig deeper into the artifacts and spend more time with each item. And so we're hoping that after this brief overview, that you folks will feel welcome and emboldened to go back to the website and take a closer look at a number of the objects. So we organized the exhibit loosely chronologically, and this is sort of and we wanted to do it on queer JAs or Japanese Americans in the broadest sense, queer meaning LGBTQ plus, right? But also folks who may not have necessarily identified as queer because these terms weren't necessarily available, but were engaging in what was considered unconventional gender and sexual practices at the time. And we're looking specifically at queer JAs before World War II, which is something that we wanted to do, particularly because there's less visibility around folks, particularly in Japanese American history. There's just less visibility before the incarceration camps. But also in terms of queer history, there's less visibility in terms of the larger queer population before actually Stonewall. So those are the reasons that we wanted to do this period in particular. So this first slide is the first section of the exhibit. We wanted to talk about queer traditions in a new world, meaning many of the cultural traditions that Japanese immigrants or Issei brought to the US, right? The myth is typically that Issei are more homophobic, more transphobic, more conservative than American-born Japanese or Nisei or Sansei, Yonsei. And in fact, if you look at the Japanese American press, right, you'll see that in the early part of their arrivals in the late 19th century, in the 1890s, all the way to the very earliest years of the 20th century, that there's quite a lot of mention of queer Japanese folks, both in Japan as well as in the US, both in terms of cross-dressing, gender impersonators, as well as same-sex sexual activity. And it's not until sort of the 1910s, 1920s where we see English language articles and excerpts in the press where there's more pejorative depictions of same-sex sexuality, queer gender in the press. And so part of what we wanted to do as an argument was to say that, you know, much of the homophobia, transphobia in the Japanese American community may actually be attributable to an American cultural value that Japanese Americans then adopted. It's not to say that Japanese are not homophobic or transphobic, but Japanese culture does have a long tradition and legacy of both queer gender and sexualities. And we can see this in sort of literary texts that other historians and literary scholars have studied. So these are just two tidbits from the exhibit. The one on the left is a page from a magazine, and it's about Yone Noguchi, whose full name is Noguchi Yonejiro. He came to the US in the 1890s, as a late teenager, I think around 19 years old. And he came to the US in hopes of becoming an English language poet. And what happens is that he develops a relationship with an older white guy named Charles Warren Stoddard. Stoddard is someone that one would call today a rice queen. He had a special affinity towards Asian and Pacific Islander men. When he meets Yone, he's quite older, but he's always had this special appreciation for Asian Pacific Islander men since his 20s when he would travel to Hawaii. And Yone Noguchi actually writes torrid letters of love to Charles Warren Stoddard, but is also kissing a fellow Issei, or Japanese immigrant, Kosen Takahashi, who is an illustrator for the Shinsekai, as well as getting engaged to Ethel Arms, who I argue that was in fact a lesbian. Ethel Arms is considered the first historian of Alabama, and she frequently said in her love letters to another woman that she would prefer to marry a woman than a man. You may know Yone Noguchi more famously, though, as the father of Isamu Noguchi, who's the very famous Asian American artist and sculptor. He's the original designer of the Noguchi tables, as well as the paper lanterns that you can often buy now at Cost Plus or World Market. To the right side of this slide, where you see Yone Noguchi and Ethel Arms, is Kosen Takahashi. You can see a little picture of him in the corner of his letter. He's the fella that Yone Noguchi was kissing. And Kosen here writes in this letter to Yone's editor, "Where's Yone? He's, I've been looking for him. He hasn't contacted me. I miss kissing him. And, we are the most queer Nipponese boys that you've ever met." And so he sort of declares his both queerness, both in his affections for Yone, as well as an actual, he uses the actual queer in his letter as well to Blanche Partington. And so it's a signal of how Issei in America in the 1890s and early 1900s in some ways had great liberty to be both queer and declare their queerness even to a stranger such as Blanche Partington.
So the next section of the exhibit covers the years between World War I and World War II. And before I describe that section some more, I just want to reference some vocabulary that we're using. So Corey used the word Nikkei a couple of times, and some of you may not know what that means. Basically, it refers to Japanese Americans and other people of Japanese ancestry living outside of Japan. So Amy and I may continue using that word. Also, Amy's mentioned Issei, which refers to Japanese immigrants. So that's a combination of the Japanese word for one and the Japanese word for generation. And generational identity among Japanese Americans is very strong. So there's the Issei generation, their children are the Nisei, second generation. Sansei are the third generation children of the Nikkei. And I'll refer back to the Issei in just a minute. So in this interwar period, especially in the beginning part of it, the Japanese American community is largely a bachelor society. So Japanese men, usually the second or third sons in their families, immigrated. They weren't able to inherit the family wealth, and so they struck out to the US, oftentimes to other countries as well, to try to make their fortunes or to make their fortunes in their return. So in these early interwar years, it's mainly bachelor Japanese immigrant male society, and they worked on railroads, they worked in agriculture, oftentimes nomadically, going from region to region. Many Japanese immigrant men were involved in domestic service as well. Some opened businesses. It wasn't until maybe about the 1910s, the teens, that immigrant community leaders on the West Coast really encouraged their fellow immigrants to marry women, to settle down, and to raise families. So there was an implicit heterosexist bias to this call for settling in the US. And many immigrant Japanese men did that. They married women from Japan. Some of you may have heard of the so-called picture bride system, where men and women would marry based on the exchange of photos, and women would arrive in the US, oftentimes never having met their husbands in person, and vice versa. So Andrew Leong, who I mentioned earlier, who's a scholar at UC Berkeley, has done a lot of pioneering research in the Japanese American press, documenting how Japanese immigrant community leaders were encouraging their fellow immigrants to settle down, and basically created the word Issei. And he's done some statistical studies of the number of times that that word Issei did or didn't appear before a certain period. He's also done some amazing work on, he's a literary scholar, so he's done some amazing work on Japanese immigrant writers, and has uncovered the kind of queer subtext, as well as the not so subtle queer subtexts to the works by Japanese immigrant authors. And there are some examples in the exhibit. Despite this call for Japanese immigrant men to settle down, to marry women, to have children, there were still Japanese immigrants who maintained a largely homosocial world. And we're speculating, based on the evidence that we could find, that today we would consider them gay. And one of those men was Jiro Inuma, who's pictured here on the right. And the Gay, Lesbian, Bisexual, Transgender Historical Society in San Francisco has a collection, a small collection, but a nevertheless significant collection of his photos and other ephemera that he collected throughout his lifetime, that show to us that at the very least he had this very intense, deep homosocial world in San Francisco with other Japanese American men. And here we see him on the right, posed similarly to this man on the left. And artist and scholar Tina Takemoto, who I referenced earlier, has done a lot of research on Jiro Inuma's life and his collection. And she points out that if you were to kind of interpose these two images, it would appear that these two men are spooning, right? And obviously they're wearing the same kind of outfit too. As Amy mentioned earlier, as the Nikkei generation, so this is the first generation born in America, as they start coming of age, they, for the most part, are largely Americanized. They embrace American culture, and along with that, American homophobia. And we see in some articles that are included in the exhibit evidence that the Nikkei generation is adopting homophobic attitudes of the larger American society. The next section of the exhibit focuses on the World War II years. And those of you who are US citizens, hopefully you know, and maybe some of you who aren't US citizens hopefully know, that during World War II, the US government incarcerated about 120,000 Japanese Americans, forcing them from their homes along the West Coast of the US into camps. The fear was that Japanese Americans, including American citizens, were spies, that they might commit acts of espionage or sabotage against the US government. And so the majority of the Japanese American community in the West Coast was forced into these camps. And as the introduction to this section here that you can see points out, the American government was not only fearful of Japanese Americans on racial grounds, they also wanted to have control over their moral lives as well. So there were camp regulations that prohibited certain kinds of acts, including homosexual behavior. But despite this, there is evidence that there were queer Japanese Americans in the camps. One of the women that Tina Takamoto discovered, originally from Japan, immigrated and lived in San Diego prior to World War I, was kind of masculine in her mannerisms. She was an entrepreneur, opened a restaurant. She was sent to the camp in Arizona called Poston. And at one point, she requested repatriation to Japan in a form that she had to fill out, or a government official filled out for her. Her gender is identified as female. She eventually decided not to return to Japan and stayed in the US. And when she was released from the camp, the form that was filled out, that all people who were released from camp had to have this form filled out for them, she's identified as male in gender. And this doesn't necessarily mean that she self-identified as transgender. Today we would consider a transgender person, but we're interpreting that change in the gender designation to indicate that whoever was filling out that form for the woman's name is Isa Shimoda, couldn't conceive of this kind of masculine appearing woman, and therefore marked her gender identity as a male. There's also a little piece in the exhibit about two Nikkei men who were born in the US, raised in Japan. They're referred to as Kibe in Japanese American culture, then returned to the US after being raised in Japan, who were arrested at a camp in Jerome, Arkansas for public drunkenness. But the reason that the security officer noticed them is because he saw these two figures kissing in the grass near a barrack and discovered that they were two men, but arrested them for drunkenness rather than for homosexual behavior. There's also some material from Jiro Inuma's collection in this section as well, showing intimacy between men in the camps. So I'm going to pass it back to Amy, who's going to take us through the last two sections of the exhibit.
So we we have a separate section on sort of how white Americans perceived Japanese in terms of gender and sexuality. And there's a section on sort of what we say, how they saw us, right? And what I want to kind of underscore here is that frequently we think of stereotypes as solid and immovable and also unchanging. But in fact, any person who studies representations would tell you that representations and stereotypes are actually constantly changing, and they might actually flip-flop from opposite sides, right? So 1 minute you're emasculated, the next minute you're hypersexual, and then 30 years later you're emasculated again, so to speak, right? That's like a common way in which stereotypes can flip-flop. You can also be simultaneously hypersexual and asexual at the same time, which is why stereotypes are so nonsensical, right? In some ways. And so this section here traces the evolution of gendered and sexual stereotypes of Japanese folks in the US, right? And there's two examples that we selected. One is it's a short story by Dora E. Amsden in the Overland Monthly, and the Overland Monthly is considered a super popular literary journal at the time, and also considered the organ of San Francisco, meaning it represents San Francisco ideas and values. But in this article, and it's from 1900, Dora Amsden praises Japanese men for being able to carefully balance the feminine as well as the masculine in their masculine gender. So at this point in 1900 in the US, there's this notion that the ideal man is both masculine and feminine, right? And so you want to be both kind of strong as well as sensitive, so to speak, right? You want to be refined and attuned to culture as well as, muscular and healthy and assertive, right? And so this article by Amsden talks about how men in Japan, particularly in the arts, are able to balance both femininity and masculinity and do it successfully. In 1921, this is the article on the right, things very much changed in terms of ideas about gender and sexuality in the US. So previously, whereas gender impersonators were praised and embraced in America for their magic and being able to cross gender, right, to embody both feminine and masculine. By 1921, there's this rising fear that gender impersonation, that people who can embody dual genders actually might be queer or homosexual, right? And that's seen as increasingly as a crime, as a sin, as something that's amoral. And so we see here in 1921, the very first article of someone who we would consider gay today being patented upon a Japanese, quote, servant whose name is Taka. Taka actually goes to college with the white protagonist here, but then drops out when the white male protagonist also leaves college. And the white male protagonist actually is married to a woman, but he has Taka as a domestic servant. And the two are clearly carrying on a sort of affair. And so it's a story of the perils of white women who might marry a gay white guy by accident, and also the ways in which Japanese men are increasingly seen as quote homosexual, right, in sort of a negative way. So this is the last section of the exhibit, and what we've seen in the past 10 years is an increasing interest in the way queer history or history inflects contemporary queer issues. It's fascinating for me to see, just because I'm a trained historian. My career is in history. I've taught history classes since 1996, and frequently history is not something that people are excited about, right? It's the class that people don't want to take, but it's part of the gen ed, and so you have to take it. They say in America that Americans are the worst at history and geography. Those are the two topics that they're the most terrible at. And so when in the past 10 years, I've seen this burgeoning interest among young people and also among artists to take on history as a tool of expression and activism, it's been super moving to me. So there's three images here that we pulled from the exhibit. One is of the aforementioned Tina Takemoto, who's both a visual and cultural theorist as well as a performance artist. And this is just one example of how Tina Takemoto, who goes by TT, creates video and performances around speculations of being of queer Japanese American figures. Also, Stan will talk a little bit about Okaeri, which is it's become a conference for queer JAs organized by Japanese Americans who are not all queer. It was actually initially started by an ally, a parent of a queer kid, who then organized a bunch of queer JAs and also allies to begin this conference for queer JAs. And then also there's been a number of nonprofits that are collecting oral histories from queer JA elders, both API Equality in Northern California as well as API Equality in LA. They're actually collecting queer histories from all Asian Americans. And so that's been super moving. And for the youth who participate in these oral history projects, they're also so inspired by the fact that there are queer people that are older than them. I think frequently when young queers come out, they think that they're the only queer in the universe, and that they're the first API queer, right? And so through collecting these oral histories and transcribing them, they realize that they're actually part of a longer legacy, part of a longer community of identity building, as well as activism. Also, a number of folks who identify as gay boys find that this space of uh, intergenerational oral history collecting is such a great space of again, friendship, right? That is not just going to the bars and, you know, drinking and hooking up. And so it also creates an alternative space of, of building family, right? Beyond sort of the bar space. And so again, you know, thinking about queer history, in particular, queer API history as a site of activism and engagement and inspiration for a new generation has been exciting for me to see as a historian, and also definitely a cultural trend that's going on that we wanted to highlight in the exhibit.
And just to build on what Amy just said about this kind of intergenerational interaction, Okaidi, which means welcome home in Japanese, and I'll say a little bit more about it in a minute, has produced this series of oral history interviews, and the image here in the middle depicts the subject of one of those oral history interviews. This is a transgender Japanese American woman. And this project came about because after one of the Okaidi conferences, a group of gay Japanese American men over 40 started meeting informally for potluck dinners. And during one of those dinners, one of the members said, "Oh, you know, did any of you know older queer Japanese Americans of the Issei or Nisei generations?" And none of us did. And we were lamenting that we didn't, because we thought, wow, our lives might have been really very different if we had known of just even one older Japanese American person who was out and proud of who they were. So that inspired Okaidi to do this series of oral history interviews. So I'm going to stop sharing for a few minutes, and Amy and I are going to be in conversation with each other about the exhibit. So Amy, do you want to start?
Sure, Stan. I wanted to ask you, why did you want to do the exhibit? I know you came to me and said, "Hey, Amy, we should do this Queer J exhibit." And I was super excited about it. Being an academic, we don't necessarily think about, you know, public history all the time. And so I was super appreciative that you reached out to say we should create material that's more accessible and do an exhibit. But can you tell us why you wanted to do an exhibit on Queer JAs?
So the genesis really goes back to Okaidi. As Corey mentioned in my introduction, I'm a co-chair of Okaidi. And our main activity, as Amy mentioned, since 2014, when the group was founded, has been a biennial conference for queer identified Japanese Americans, our supportive family members, and allies. And before the 2018 Okaidi conference, one of the organizing committee members came up with the idea of doing kind of an art project / exhibit. And each of the Okaidi conferences have been held at the Japanese American National Museum in downtown Los Angeles. And this Okaidi organizing committee member knew of a local artist in Los Angeles who had taken portraits for various groups and had kind of mounted them on like old newsprint or old pages of old books, and created these collages of images of people associated with those groups. So one of the projects this artist did, Mike Saijo, was with a group called Homeboy Industries, which is based here in Los Angeles for folks who are trying to lead gangs or who have left gangs. So he did this beautiful portrait series of former gang members. So this Okaidi organizing committee member knew Mike Saijo, asked him if he would do a similar project for Okaidi, and he said yes. And so he had a series of sessions with folks within Okaidi, organizing committee members, as well as broader community members who identify as queer or supportive family members or allies. And he created these series of photos. So this is the photo of me and my husband that we took as part of that project. And we displayed these photos at the Japanese American National Museum during the Okaidi 2018 conference. So that project kind of got me thinking, like, here we're hosted by a museum puts on exhibits, we're a queer JA group. Would the Japanese American National Museum be interested in putting on an exhibit on queer JA history at the same time as an Okaidi conference? And so I approached the chief curator at the Japanese American National Museum to see if they would be interested in such an exhibit. And the chief curator said yes, but they would basically need a lot of funding to do this and would look to us, Okaidi specifically, to provide that funding. So that was kind of a little bit of a setback, and I let the ideas just kind of simmer for a while. And then Amy kind of referenced that I reached out to you. So at the Okaidi 2018 conference, Amy and I spoke, and Amy really encouraged me to, because the outline I presented to the Japanese American National Museum was like from soup to nuts, covered everything. So Amy encouraged me to really focus in on just one specific thing, theme, or period. And she asked me what was most interesting to me of this larger outline. And I said, oh, it's the early history that's really the most interesting to me, because as Amy said earlier, it's kind of the least known within larger Japanese American history, but also within queer history as well. So that was really the genesis for the exhibit. And I'm super grateful to Amy for agreeing to be a co-curator, because she is one of the leading scholars. I've done no original research on the time period that's covered in our exhibit, whereas Amy has. And so a lot of her research has been folded into the exhibit. So thank you, Amy, for agreeing and for including your research in the exhibit, which is a segue to my question to you. Since you have spent decades researching queer Japanese American history, did you learn anything new in putting this exhibit together? And if so, what was that?
Sure. So when I started my dissertation in 1998, there were things that were digitized, but not very much, right? And so for my one of my books, where I studied turn of the century San Francisco from 1890 to 1920, I literally I read 4 San Francisco newspapers page by page, day by day. Even it was grueling in terms of time and energy. And recently, Stanford, in fact, digitized a whole bunch of Japanese American newspapers through their project. It's called Hoji Shimbun, and it's accessible on the web for free. Basically, you go to the site, and then you can keyword search things like lesbian or gay or homosexual or even sodomy, and all the articles will come up that have those keywords in it. You can also use the Japanese words like nanshoku, danshoku, keyword search those words, and all the articles in the Japanese language newspapers, Japanese language articles will all pop up from all of the different newspapers that are part of the Japanese American press, right? And so I went to the Hoji Shimbun database for this exhibit and did just that, to look up articles. And I was astounded at the number of Japanese American, Japanese language articles in the Japanese American press that had the word, talking about sort of a gender impersonation, same-sex sexuality among men, right? And they were written in a non-pejorative, matter-of-fact manner. In one case, there was an article praising this activist who was looking at women who are committing suicide in Japan. And this is in the again, late 1890s, early 1900s. And this article is in the exhibit as well. But basically the article said, oh, there's this activist in Japan who's looking at women committing suicide. And now she's looking particularly at Japanese women who are lesbians killing themselves, right? And to me, that was like, whoa, lesbians, that was a big deal. I see that in the press. And also folks were saying like, oh, so it's so great that she's saving these lesbian lives versus like, just throwing them in the garbage. And it was all super moving. I think as queer studies scholars who study at the intersection of race and sexuality, we call them queer of color theorists, or also queer ethnic studies. typically we have this idea, there's an idea that homophobia, transphobia is specifically white American context in the space of US history, right? Even though today, white Americans blame immigrant communities of color for being more homophobic, more transphobic than white folks in America. But typically, if you do queer ethnic studies, you kind of think or believe your ideology, your foundational framework is that it's likely that communities of color trying to fit into American culture to mitigate stigma for their race would want to be as normative as possible in terms of sexuality and gender, and therefore adopt American notions of homophobia, transphobia. There's a political scientist, Black lesbian political scientist named Kathy Cohen, who talks about this in her book called Boundaries of Blackness, which is about how the Black church is filled with all these gay men, but they don't talk about it because they're trying to kind of mitigate stigma around their race already. But this was the first time when I put together this exhibit that I actually saw quantitative evidence of that, right? So I'd seen some qualitative evidence based on love letters and the way, and literature also from Japan, versus things that are going on in the US. But it was the first time when I can actually count the number of articles that were matter of fact, about queers in the US in the Japanese language versus increasingly pejorative articles written in the English language around queers in the Japanese American press. And Stan, what did you learn from putting together the exhibit?
Well, like you, I was just floored by what you discovered, through the Stanford newspaper collections, because it really just kind of blew open this preconception I had that the Issei generation were homophobic, right? So it was just mind-blowing to me when you found all those articles. And kind of gets back to what I was saying earlier about sort of the intergenerational or lack of knowledge about prior generations. It just really reshaped my thinking about that generation. And along those lines, Andrew Leung's research on the queerness of Japanese American immigrant writing has been really revelatory. In another life, I was a literary scholar and I intended to become an English professor a million years ago and didn't go down that route. So Andrew's research is sort of like my vicarious, thrill of him discovering these things and sharing that work with the world. So those were just super exciting things for me to learn about in the process of putting this exhibit together. And one thing that I think that viewers would be interested in learning, I'm going to share my screen again, so bear with me, is what we found to be our favorite objects in the exhibit. So Amy, what is your favorite object in the exhibit?
Sure. So if you could go to the next slide. Okay, great. So this is a carte de visite of Yone Noguchi, who's the immigrant poet who I mentioned early on in our conversation. And, as you can see, Yone Noguchi is super good looking, right? And what these immigrants did, or actually what Americans did at the turn of the century, was that they would give photographs of each other to one another. It's like almost like a business card, but you would give a photograph, carte de visite, to one another, and you would sign it. And this one was given to Charles Warren Stoddard. And if you notice, the inscription at the top says, "To Dad Stoddard from Yone Noguchi," and the date is 1903, right? It's pretty incredible. When previous scholars looked at this photograph, right, there's one person named Ikuko Atsumi, who's from Japan, and she was studying Yone Noguchi for a little bit. And during that time, she argued that Yone and Stoddard had a father-son relationship, okay? And this inscription would be evidence of that, okay, "To Dad Stoddard." If you're queer, you would know that, in the queer community, we have what's called intergenerational love. And, some straight folks do it too when older folks get together with younger folks, right? And so if you saw that "To Dad Stoddard" and you were queer and you had a more diverse sense of sexuality, you would think, oh, is that really a father-son relationship? Or is it something else? So obviously, I went digging a little bit and then dug through love letters between Stoddard and Noguchi. And they talk about sitting in each other's laps and fondling each other and cuddling up in bed together. They express love for each other. That is clearly more along the lines of an intergenerational affair rather than a father-son relationship. Notably also, Stoddard actually was frequently a dad to many quote unquote boys, who are not boys, they're young men in their 20s and 30s. But he would have these what we would consider daddy boy relationships with a number of younger men. And so to me, it's both a sign of intergenerational love, right? Gay male intimacy, right? As well as like this tradition of handing out your business card at the turn of the century, but definitely having this sort of queer, twist to it. I think that's all. I'd love to talk more about this. I love this image so much that obviously I used it as the cover for my book on Yone Noguchi as well. Yeah. Stan, what's your favorite object?
So this is my favorite object in the exhibit. And as you can tell, it's this kind of kitschy postcard that has a penis attached to the matador here. And that penis detaches, and it's actually a tie clip. And Tina Takamoto discovered this in Jiro Inuma's collection at the GLBT Historical Society in San Francisco. And this is so fascinating to me on a number of levels. One is that this object even exists in the world and was created in the earlier part of the 20th century, we're assuming. B, that a Japanese immigrant man would own this and keep it for his lifetime. So obviously it meant something to him to retain it. I'm old enough to remember my Japanese immigrant grandparents as older people. And my image of that generation is being like kind of docile, gentle, nothing risque about them at all. So this sort of blows my mind again, like the research that you uncovered, Amy, and Andrew Leong's research, that Issei, when you think about a bachelor society, they're going to be rowdy, right, in their 20s. And so this kind of humanizes that generation for me, and to know that they had daring lives. I mean, they left Japan and went to other parts of the world, so that's daring in and of itself. But there was also a queer sensibility to some of them as well. And they expressed that, through things like buying something like this. And so this object to me is kind of a link to a queer ancestor of mine from 2 generations ago. So that's why this is my favorite object in the exhibit.
And Stan, if I could just point out the crafts, the handiwork sort of on the tie clip, right? That sort of the scrotum of the penis is even dimpled and textured, which is what's incredible to me, right?
Right.
And maybe Stan, next time you can use that, if you get your hands on that postcard, you can use that tie clip to fasten your tie to your shirt.
I don't know if they'll let me take it from the archives, but, yeah. But you're right, you don't see craftsmanship like that anymore on penis-shaped tie clips.
For sure, for sure.
So before opening it up for questions and answers, I just want to share the link to the Seen and Unseen exhibit. So the web link is at the bottom of the slide, seenandunseen.net. It's going to be up for another week, so rush to see it if you haven't seen it already. It has been archived, we know, by the Internet Archives, so it is accessible that way, but it's a little less easy to access. And then finally, I just wanted to encourage you to join Okaidi at our virtual conference, which is going to take place November 12th through the 14th. And registration will be open August 31st. And to learn more about the conference, as well as other Okaidi programs, you can visit the website down here, okaidi-losangeles.com, or follow our Instagram at okaidi_LA. So Corey, we'll hand it back to you to moderate the Q&A.
Great. And Thank you all so much for that. It was great. It was informative. It was a little cheeky. Oh man, you heard it here first, people. You heard it here first. So we're going to move on to our Q&A segment here. Actually, if we can go ahead, and I just want to make sure that we've stopped the recording here. So we're going to